Thanks, Chairman Grassley. I want to thank you particularly for a comment you recently made where you said, quote, "You can't impeach a judge just because you disagree with their opinion," end of quote. It shouldn't have to be said, but I hope every member of this committee will make that equally clear today. Indeed, in our nation's 250-year history, a judge has never been impeached because a president disagreed with that judge's ruling. But we do need to say so loudly and clearly, as you did, Mr. Chairman, as President Trump and co-President Elon Musk have demanded the impeachment of federal judges who have ruled against the administration. House Republicans have rushed to kiss the ring, so far filing articles of impeachment against 6 federal judges and counting. The dangerous, irresponsible conduct of the president and his allies has resulted in a truly disturbing increase in threats against our federal judges and represent an existential threat to judicial independence. During my time on this committee, I've met with several judges whose lives have been threatened simply because of their service on the bench. Some of these threats have turned into acts of violence that have taken the lives of judges' family members, including spouses, parents, and children. It affected my state in the Northern District. I've said it many times before in this committee, and I want to say it again here. Violence or threats of violence from the right or the left on the political spectrum are never acceptable. When I was chair of this committee, I repeatedly condemned threats against Republican-appointed justices and judges, and we passed bipartisan legislation to improve security for the bench. We must speak with one bipartisan voice on this issue. Last week, my staff spoke with several judges about judicial security. Every single judge said exactly the same thing. The threats have become more frequent and more disturbing. And while these judges were careful not to comment on political issues, they noted that recent rhetoric against judges has contributed to increased threats to judicial security. One judge likened it to adding fuel to a bonfire, and she noted her fear that in time it would become a wildfire out of control. We must avoid that outcome, but it will require the President and his fellow Republicans, including members of this committee, to work together with the Democrats to lower the temperature and end the attacks on judges and judiciary. This hearing is about nationwide injunctions. It's impossible to separate the hearing from President Trump's record in office. The reality is that we would not be holding this hearing if the president took a different approach to the rule of law. We've heard repeated complaints from Republicans about the number of injunctions issued against this president compared to other presidents. Why so many? They ignore the fact that this president has issued more than 100 executive orders, the most by any president at this point in his term in at least 4 decades. Many are clearly illegal. Take the president's executive order to end birthright citizenship. 3 federal judges in 3 different states have blocked this order, including 2 judges appointed by Republican presidents, and 3 separate appeals courts have refused to lift these injunctions. Judge John Kunar, who was appointed by President Ronald Reagan, was the first judge to block the order, which he called, quote, blatantly unconstitutional. The reality is that the number of injunctions issued against the first and second Trump administration are evidence of a president who is clearly violating the law. That being said, I'm happy to discuss the legal and practical implications of nationwide injunctions. But as I've said many times before, we cannot have one set of rules for Republicans and another set of rules for Democrats. Any legislation on this topic must be based on the merits, not political expediency. Professor Bray, in your testimony before the committee, recall a decision by a Texas court about 10 years ago on DAPA. That's near and dear to my heart. That is based on the DREAM Act, which I introduced a long time ago. And my pleadings with President Obama to create that program meant a lot to me personally. I recall when that issue came before the court in Texas, and the judge issued a universal injunction to enforce it. I would add, as the chairman has noted, there was cheering from the Republican senators from Texas for that decision. Some of them today see the issue differently, in the context of a president of their own party. I cannot support legislation that does not take reality into consideration. Only if we have an effective date that makes sense would I consider making any changes myself. In 1776, in a pamphlet appropriately titled Common Sense, Thomas Paine famously wrote, quote, "In America, the law is king, for as in absolute governments, the king is the law. So in free countries, the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other." Today, we'll discuss the use of nationwide injunctions, but there can be no debate that in America, the law is king, as it has been since our founding. The president is not a king, not even this president, as much as he might wish otherwise. He is bound by the decisions of our courts, just like every other American. Now, the president and his political allies are welcome to disagree with judicial decisions that block his illegal actions, but we cannot allow anyone to threaten or intimidate our judges. And we cannot stand idly by amid a threat to our Constitution and the separation of powers. The chairman has asked me to introduce my witness, and I'll be glad to do that. Professor Stephen Vladeck is the Agnes Williams Sesquicentennial Professor of Federal Courts at Georgetown University Law Center. I knew Mrs. Williams. He is a nationally recognized expert on the federal courts, the Supreme Court, national security law, and military justice. Professor Vladeck is also highly regarded as an appellate advocate, having argued several cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and over a dozen before various lower federal, civilian, and military courts. Graduate of Yale Law School and Amherst College. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.